Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled 3D Printing of Medical Devices, What the Future Holds for Regulating and Litigating Medical Device Failures for Point-of-Service Manufacturers and Users. I'm Courtney Young, an attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Daniel Tranen, thank you for joining us. Daniel is a partner in the Edwardsville, Illinois and Clayton, Missouri offices of Wilson Elser. He is an accomplished litigator who has handled matters across the litigation spectrum throughout the U.S. during his legal career. His practice ranges from the defense of entities in mass tort and single claim product liability matters, class actions and insurance coverage matters, to employment, transportation, environmental, toxic torts, and commercial litigation disputes. Daniel's primary focus is on the defense of life sciences companies for individual claims and in the area of mass torts. He has been serving as National Coordinating Counsel, handling product liability matters for a major international life sciences company and its affiliates for nearly 10 years. His past and current work includes representing clients in mass torts involving the national pain pump litigation, the heparin contamination crisis, dozens of cases involving allegedly contaminated flesh syringes, the defense as local counsel of NECC and the national meningitis outbreak, and most recently knee implants and cold therapy devices. He has previously defended life sciences companies in cases involving spinal implants, catheters, infusers, stents, IVC filters, dental implants, orthopedic screws, and allegedly contaminated allografts. Daniel has twice been awarded trophies for outstanding advocacy by Medmarc at our annual panel council meeting. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Daniel, who will begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Courtney. Good day to everyone listening. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar presentation on 3D printing medical devices. The purpose of this presentation is to highlight one of the most exciting technological innovations of the 21st century and to conduct a bit of a thought experiment regarding how this innovation, 3D printing, particularly in the context of the manufacture of medical devices, is likely to impact and be impacted by the FDA regulation and the development of product liability law. I'm going to give just a brief rundown of the presentation and then dive right in. So first I'm going to talk about the two main hypotheses for this thought experiment. I'm going to talk about 3D manufacturing, what it is and why it is so significant. I'm going to describe the exponential rise of 3D printing of medical devices, especially in the point of service context, meaning when a medical device is printed and then used by doctors and hospitals or anyone else, as opposed to where a medical device is manufactured and sold through the stream of commerce, as for example, through a distributor or directly to a hospital or a doctor for use in the treatment of a patient. I'm going to discuss the medical devices that are already being 3D printed and how 3D printing offers a revolution in the creation of these devices. I'm going to talk about the FDA's regulation of 3D printing of medical devices, describe the litigation and potential claims involving these printed devices, and discuss how point-of-service devices are likely to be treated differently in the law than standard medical devices in product liability suits. Finally, I'm going to talk about risk management in light of all of these various events. So there's a lot to cover today. First, I'm going to talk about the hypothesis. These are my two hypotheses for the thought experiment that I'm going to discuss. It is a thought experiment because there really has not been any true development in the law concerning 3D printing of medical devices, especially for point-of-service makers and users of these products. And because the FDA guidance we have received does not address point-of-service manufacturing of medical devices, which is where we are seeing rapid growth in this industry. So our two hypotheses are, one, that the FDA will have difficulty regulating non-traditional point-of-service 3D printing and use of medical devices by hospitals, doctors, and others, and I believe will likely decline to do so. And second, that non-traditional point-of-service manufacturing of medical devices made possible by the advent of 3D printing will so disrupt traditional product liability law that we will see something completely different in the next 5 to 10 years as courts grapple with this new technology. So what is 3D printing and how is it developing? What we know is that 3D printing really began in the 1980s as a new and innovative form of manufacturing called additive manufacturing. Prior to additive manufacturing, Manufacturing was either subtractive, meaning that you created something by removing material, or it involved putting items together into something bigger or more complex from components. Those components also had to be manufactured either through smaller components and sometimes just by using things like molds to create individual objects. Additive manufacturing is different. It involves creating a whole final product or device simply by slowly adding in material until a final shape or design is created. The product is printed using raw material like wood or metal or plastic by a quote printer unquote, and the printer adds in the material pursuant to a computer-aided design file, or what's known as a CAD file. So what goes into 3D? So when you 3D print, you need the following. Number one, a printer, and there are many types of printers and ways that you can 3D print, which I'll talk about in a moment. You need raw materials with which to print, and this could include wood, metal, plastic, silicone, carbon fiber, and as we'll discuss, even biological materials. You need the CAD file, which contains the design information needed to tell the printer how to print, what it's printing, the structure, and to form the final product. And then finally, in some cases, you need an image file. And this is used especially when you want to design a product to conform to a particular image, which we will also discuss at great depth today. There are at least 7 types of additive manufacturing, which might be the subject of 3D printing, and more types of additive manufacturing are being developed all the time. The 2 most common are what are referred to as material jetting, where the printer deposits droplets of raw material into a pattern according to the design file, and material extrusion, which is where the printer expels through a nozzle like a hose raw material into a pattern, again, according to a design file. Beyond that, it can get more complicated. You have things like binder jetting, where a binding agent is deployed by the printer to selectively join raw powder materials. Directed bed fusion, where thermal energy is used to fuse materials by melting as the material is being deposited. Again, this occurs according to the design file. Shear lamination, where sheets of material are bonded together according to a design in order to form a final product. Powder bed fusion, where thermal energy is used to selectively fuse areas of powder within a powder bed. And vat photopolymerization, where a liquid photopolymer, which is contained within a vat, is selectively heated by light-activated polymerization. A product printed on one type of printer may not yield the same type of product on another printer. So, when you think of 3D printing, we're not thinking about something like McDonald's, where every burger you make is going to taste and look the same. If you buy a printer and you buy the raw materials, so in the process of printing something, you buy your printer, then you buy your raw materials, and then you need to get the CAD file. You might buy that too, but once a CAD file becomes publicly available, others can copy it and, more importantly, modify it. So once a CAD file becomes public, there's really no way to control it. It's just like software in general. People will hack and steal and use and copy and change and do things to what is effectively software. Additive manufacturing is already a billion-dollar market, and it is growing at a rate of 20% per year. President Obama said just a few years ago that 3D printing, quote, has the potential to revolutionize how we make almost everything. And it's doing just that. 3D printing can revolutionize manufacturing, first by the types of materials we can manufacture with. As we'll discuss, we can already 3D print human organs, including a human heart. Secondly, we can manufacture designs that were never possible to create before using this additive process instead of these other assembly or subtractive processes. We can manufacture complete objects that had once required assembly to make. And we can manufacture custom designs so much more efficiently and inexpensively in the 3D printing process than you could do in any other manufacturing process. Right now, 1/10 of the market for additive manufacturing is in the medical and dental technologies field. It will be a multi-billion-dollar market in just the next couple of years. Lots of people are printing medical devices, But this aspect of the market has not yet really been regulated by the FDA. In fact, to date, the FDA has only issued a guidance with its initial thoughts about 3D manufacturing. Point of service growth is really the nub of my presentation today. Hospitals all over the country are investing and have invested in 3D printing facilities. They are expanding these facilities and they are printing medical devices for their own use and in some cases for the use of others. And why not? As we go through the various uses of 3D printing in the medical field, it will be apparent that it simply makes sense for these point of service users of medical devices to print the devices themselves. It's faster, it's cheaper, and you can build custom designs using imaging that the hospital will do itself. So let's talk about the medical devices that these point of service facilities and others can manufacture for themselves using the 3D printing technology. The first is surgical instruments. Surgical instruments are quick and easy to manufacture using 3D printers. They're cost effective. A retractor that you might see a surgeon use costs about 1/10 the price to 3D print as compared to purchasing one via a traditional surgical instrument manufacturer. 3D printing offers design flexibility. For example, custom-made surgical guides can be 3D printed. 3D printing offers minimal production time for a device, and it offers the possibility of innovative surgical instruments. Here's an example. There's a type of surgery called a keyhole heart surgery, which is similar to, or what one might describe as a laparoscopic surgery of the heart. The surgeon performs this surgery, or this type of heart surgery, while the heart is still beating, and it requires the tiniest incision for the surgeon to get to the area of the heart in need of repair. A British surgeon invented a surgical device that would aid this type of surgery. Did he go to a medical device manufacturer to have it made and tested, etc.? No, he did not. Instead, with the help of a graphic designer, he created a CAD file to print the device he had designed. It took about 90 days from the start of the process to the creation of the device. It otherwise would have taken years. It cost him about $20,000 to make this brand new medical device. It would have otherwise cost millions of dollars for a traditional manufacturer to R&D process and get approval for the sale of such a device. After designing and printing this device, he just started using it. Surgeons are routinely involved in the development and testing of new medical devices. If they can design and print those devices by themselves, they can sidestep all of the barriers to entry into the medical device industry simply by using a 3D printer. Anatomical modeling is another example of how 3D printing has revolutionized medicine. With this modeling, a surgeon can take an image of a patient's body and then print that image. With the printed model, the surgeon then can plan for complex surgeries in ways that were never before possible. Even more incredibly, surgeons can undertake practice runs of complex surgeries using these models to time the particular parts of the surgery and to determine if the things that they want to do surgically are even possible to do. Obviously, if you're doing with a model, you're not putting the patient at risk. You're planning out, you're making your mistakes, you're figuring everything out before you even have the patient on the operating table. As a result, this is a life-saving development. It is a development that radically improves healthcare. And without additive manufacturing, such modeling would in many cases either not be possible or it would be cost prohibitive to do. Surgeons are routinely using anatomical modeling via models 3D printed in hospitals, and this is a classic point of service use of 3D printing. One of the most useful aspects of 3D printing any product, and especially medical devices, is the ease and cost efficiency of customizing devices to a particular patient's needs or anatomy. This is especially important for prosthetics and implants, where one size or even multiple sizes that you might get off the shelf do not necessarily fit all. With these implants and prosthetics, imaging of the patient's anatomy is incorporated into the CAD file to generate a printed device that corresponds to the patient's anatomy. This creates better devices, and it does so in a way and at a cost that would be unimaginable without 3D printing technology. Another example of the use of 3D printing in this area is the creation of bandages for burn victims. You want the bandage to be shaped in a precise way based upon and you can do so using imaging based upon the burn victim's body, imaging of the body. These bandages are precisely created again, at a low cost and with fabulous results for patients. And again, with prosthetics, especially, you often need replacement parts. With 3D printing, these replacement parts can be done at a low cost and to specification for the person who needs the prosthetic limb fixed. 3D printing also allows for the creation of force measuring sensors that interact with the human body, and again, with imaging, the specific dimensions of the human body at issue. For example, already on the market are glucose biosensors, which are custom fit for a patient that measures the patient's glucose levels and raises alarms when a patient's blood glucose level gets too high or too low. With that biosensor, specifically custom fit to the patient, this becomes a great new technology, and it's a far cry from the pinprick blood sampling that we normally associate with checking someone's glucose. The additive process allows the manufacturer to literally build the device around the sensor. Finally, with respect to organic devices, this is really the cutting edge of 3D printing, and it represents the most amazing and most promising use of this technology, in my mind. Cellular material is taken from a patient, grown, and then used as bioink to build living tissue and now even living organs. Bioprinting involves depositing layers of cells in a computer-aided design pattern, just like what we've talked about before, and that controls cell aggregation until a living 3D structure is created. This can be done with specialized compartments and with individual cell types, if you've got multiple cell types going into a single organ. Scientists in Israel printed this year a living, working human heart. Obviously, the heart wasn't put into somebody's body, but that is a realistic next step or future step for that process. Scientists are printing replacement bone, heart valves, kidneys, livers, skin, ears, everything that you might think. Less complex living tissue is already being used in surgeries. We can expect printable and implantable organs to be printed and used by physicians and hospitals, hopefully within the next decade, maybe sooner, maybe a little bit longer, but this is a process that we're going to get to this point. In 2017, 116,000 Americans were on waiting lists for organs. Only 34,000 of them got organs. Some people have been waiting up to 5 years for kidneys. What if we close this gap, and we do so with tissue that the recipient is not going to reject because that tissue came from the recipient? It's just an amazing future development. It's science fiction 10 years ago. It's going to be reality soon. And that's an amazing thing. So who are the players involved with this technology? Well, there's lots of people. Traditional device manufacturers are starting to incorporate this additive manufacturing process into their own manufacturing. These include implant manufacturers like Smith & Nephew, Stryker, and Medtronic. Newer manufacturers have created a brand around 3D printing. For example, there's a company called Conformis, which makes knee implants based upon patient imaging scans. Researchers are focusing on bioprinting, but also other areas like modeling. Hospitals are printing surgical instruments, implants, and anatomical mapping. 3D printing centers are starting to pop up to provide service to device users like hospitals and doctors' offices. As prices come down for printers, there will be lower barriers to entry into the market, and even more market players will emerge. So I'm going to now look at the traditional system and talk about and really do a compare and contrast between the traditional medical device system, manufacturing system, and how this new technology is going to disrupt it. The traditional medical device product design and manufacture distribution network is generally just a long chain. On the supply side, you have component suppliers or part suppliers and potentially contract manufacturers. The designer manufacturer then sells the finished product through a distribution chain. The distributors, and that chain could be made up of distributors, it could be made up of independent sales force, or even an internal sales force by the designer manufacturer. all of which will send a medical device to the ultimate end user, which is either going to be generally a hospital or a doctor. This is relatively easy to regulate. The manufacturer is identifiable, the person responsible for labeling is identifiable, the product designer is identifiable. You cannot sell a medical device in the United States, or at least you're not supposed to, without clearance from the FDA. So even if Smith & Nephew or Medtronic are printing devices using additive manufacturing, the overall sales and distribution process is basically the same for these traditional manufacturers. They're getting their raw materials, they're manufacturing their products, maybe using this additive manufacturing process, but then they're selling it with the blessing of the FDA. As we know, the FDA permits the sale of medical devices manufactured in this way through three general pathways. The 510K clearance is the most common pathway. As we know, more than 90% of medical devices are cleared for sale through this process. In order to meet the standard, the manufacturer must show substantial equivalence to a prior cleared product. They get the clearance from the FDA, and then they can just start selling the product. Obviously, the PMA, pre-market approval process, is the most stringent and expensive way to get a medical device approved. You don't necessarily have a substantially equivalent prior cleared device, i.e. it's a new device. A product approved through this process, though, and it's generally a Class 3 device, then gets the broad federal preemption protections if a claim does arise especially out of an alleged failure to warn. This framework is really predicated. This framework, including the 510K and the PMA process, is really predicated on the sale of devices to third parties. But what we're going to be talking about today is, what if the devices are not being sold? As we know, the FDA regulates three classes of medical devices, from basic Class 1 devices all the way up to Class 3 complex and life savings devices. These classes determine the type of FDA approval needed to market the medical device. But again, this all considers and assumes that the medical device is being marketed. Think back to our British surgeon who designed and then started printing a device for his own use. Didn't have to go through this process, even if it was done in the United States, because he did it himself and he used it himself. He didn't sell it. The FDA is clearing via the 510K process products printed by using the 3D printing process or additive manufacturing process by traditional medical device manufacturers. And this slide identifies that some of the types of implants and devices that are being printed, including dentures, and there's even been at least one example of a 510K approving clearance for 3D printed pharmaceuticals by Apprecia. But the 510K process really only these approvals really only involve traditional manufacturers. So, and devices are also, in effect, regulated through the civil litigation process. What I mean by that is, if there's a problem with a device and the FDA does not recall the device from the market, it's possible that the cost and expense of litigation over a device, or an allegedly defective device, might effectively cause the seller to leave the marketplace. Product liability lawsuits focus on three different types of claims. Defective design defects, which are defects in how the device was designed. The classic example that one might think of is the Ford Pinto, where Ford put the gas tank in the rear of the car, and when there was a rear impact on the car, it caused those cars to explode. And so this Ford Pinto was was allegedly defectively designed because of where they put the gas tank. Manufacturing defects, which are defects that arise in the manufacturing process. An example of that is something I worked on called the contaminated heparin crisis, which involved a host of medical devices that incorporated heparin, which was contaminated with another substance, and that caused patients who received the heparin through these devices to have allergic reaction to the heparin, causing injuries. The incorporation of this substance into the product was alleged to be a manufacturing defect in the product. And then third, the third type of way in which medical device manufacturers are sued is for warnings defects. And that's where the warnings do not accurately or effectively communicate dangers about a product to the product user. For medical devices, this is usually the doctor, and of course, as we know, this doctor is considered to be a learned intermediary, and that's a defense that we see. The key aspect of product liability claims is that in most jurisdictions, the standard for liability is strict liability, which means that the plaintiff need only prove that a defect exists and that it caused an injury in order to recover against the manufacturer. The plaintiff does not have to explain how the defect occurred or prove that anyone was negligent in allowing the defect to persist. That's not part of the strict liability claim that they have. The existence of the defect and causation is enough to establish liability by the product manufacturer or designer if those two elements and damages can be proven. And this is a very low threshold, and it's a big reason why product liability claims are attractive for plaintiffs to bring. So I've given you the traditional framework of how medical devices are regulated through the FDA framework and how that framework holds medical device companies accountable in civil litigation for defective product or an allegedly defective product. 3D printing of medical devices by doctors and hospitals and others who might use them, including, I guess, potentially self-use by patients, for example, turns this framework on its ear. This is the key disruption. Consider the following hypothetical. A doctor finds online a CAD file from a reputable source. She puts the device, a surgical instrument for a surgical technique she read about, using the hospital's 3D printer. The surgical instrument breaks during the surgery, and this causes a patient injury. The framework we have discussed doesn't apply. No one marketed this device. The FDA did not approve this device for sale. The device was not sold. The device did not come with any warnings. If the device was purchased from a manufacturer, the plaintiff would know who to sue. It would be the manufacturer. So who is liable for the broken surgical instrument under these circumstances? Is it the printer manufacturer? Is it the doctor who printed it? Is it the CAD file creator? Is it the hospital who owns the printer? Is it someone else? Also importantly, is any one of these people going to be liable for the manufacturing or design defect under a strict liability standard? We're going to answer all these questions in a moment, but first I want to digress to what the FDA says should happen. So what the FDA has said about medical devices printed using 3D printing is contained within a guidance, or what they call a leapfrog guidance, that was issued in December 2017. So what does this mean? This guidance is not a regulation. It's not a statute passed by Congress. It's really just a group of suggestions on what manufacturers using 3D printing technology should do in the absence of any other legal guidance. Moreover, the guidance is only described as the FDA's initial thoughts about 3D printing. More than 18 months later, we don't have any further thoughts from the FDA. The focus of the guidance is to tell industry that the requirements for 510K clearances and PMA marketing are still applicable to traditional medical device manufacturers who use this technology. Industries still must follow good manufacturing statutes and regulations. Devices must be substantially equivalent to predicate devices before 510K approval will be given. However, there's no recognition in this guidance and certainly no discussion regarding the point of service users of medical devices, i.e. doctors and hospitals, who could effectively manufacture themselves through the 3D printing process and then use them. There's also no guidance regarding those cutting-edge technology like bioprinting using 3D printers. So what is the future of regulation for point of service additive manufacturing of medical devices? These omissions from the FDA, I think, leaves us with three important questions about the FDA and the regulation of point of service manufacture and use of medical devices. First, with the decentralization of manufacturing processes and design files, does the FDA have the resources to actually regulate this? I would suggest it doesn't. FDA is already overstretched trying to audit and regulate traditional medical device manufacturers, both in the U.S. and those overseas who seek to import medical devices into this country. Even if they wanted to, and as I'll discuss, I don't think they do, or the FDA does, with the effective democratization of medical device manufacturing using 3D printing, it's really not going to be particularly practical for FDA to go into every hospital and doctor's office and third-party printing facility to do these types of audits. And there's no clear indication that the FDA intends to do just that. It would certainly need a lot more resources if it did want to. Secondly, will point-of-service manufacturing by medical professionals be seen as the practice of medicine and regulated locally? It seems to me that this is where this is likely going to be going. The FDA makes a point of not regulating the practice of medicine. This is the job of local medical boards. If a doctor prints an implant and implants the device into the person, which is effectively custom-made for that individual because it used that individual's body scans, the FDA may just it just may be the FDA's ultimate position that the device made by the doctor, or the making of this device by the doctor, is the practice of medicine by that doctor. Certainly, this is concerning because it's a slippery slope that may lead to a big problem. As Courtney mentioned, I was local counsel for New England Compounding Pharmacy, which was involved in litigation arising out of a nationwide meningitis outbreak that killed, or allegedly killed, dozens of people. The issue there was that the compounding pharmacy was effectively, or allegedly effectively, manufacturing steroid injections, even though it was supposed to be a compounding pharmacy. Because it was supposed to be compounding drugs and not manufacturing them, it was subject to regulation by the local pharmacy board, not by the FDA. Arguably, and this is an argument that was made, had the FDA regulated NECP, it might have shut the place down before this meningitis outbreak, which allegedly arose out of the unsanitary conditions in the facility's clean room. It should be noted that the FDA also does not regulate the creation of custom devices, and this is actually discussed and noted in the FDA guidance. However, to be a custom device, the manufacturer cannot make more than 5 custom devices in a year. So this makes it unlikely the FDA will be treating 3D printed devices under this exception to the Act, leaving only the practice of medicine and the fact that the devices are not being marketed in the traditional sense as reasons for the FDA not to regulate them. Finally, what happens when hospitals start marketing 3D printed medical devices to third parties? This is the nub of the issue, right? It is my understanding that some hospitals are doing just that. And those hospitals may not be necessarily following good manufacturing practices as required by regulation and statute and other industry standards concerning the production and marketing of a medical device. In reality, if the hospital is 3D printing medical devices and selling them to third parties, they could very well be subject to those regulations and statutes. But it may be that because they're not traditionally in this space, the manufacturing space, they may not understand the risks associated with manufacturing and marketing. And those, of course, those risks would include the attendant risk of facing a potential strict liability claim for the devices if they were to cause a patient injury. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about 3D printing and litigation. In general, as we know, uncertainty begets litigation. There's a lot of potential litigation surrounding 3D printing precisely because there's so little settled law around it. Potential patent and IP issues surround the use of the CAD files. Coverage issues relating to whether printing a device is a professional services will almost certainly arise. And of course, product liability claims and how they will be handled, including what is the product, for instance? Is it the device itself or is it the CAD file? If the CAD file is sold to the user and the device is not. We'll be watching to see how this law develops over the next decade or so. And to the extent that we have product liability lawyers on this call, they and I will likely be front and center in how this law develops. So let's continue with our thought experiment. Imagine that a medical device, let's say an implant, is printed by a doctor or a hospital and used in a surgery at the hospital or by that doctor. The device fails and causes a patient injury. Who's liable? Under the classic product liability scenario, the product designer or manufacturer is strictly liable with any distributor. If the implant failure was caused by a mistake made by the doctor, then the doctor is liable for any negligence. In the 3D printing situation, the source of liability is less clear. This doctor still might be liable for any negligence in the surgery to implant the device, but there is no classical manufacturer or designer who sold a product, and there is no distributor of the device either. As a result, instead of simply holding a distributor and manufacturer strictly liable, we are left to try to figure out who is actually liable. And the list is long, set forth in this slide. The predicate device might have been defectively designed. The computer-aided design file might have been defectively designed. The defect might have been introduced into the CAD file during the copying, sharing, or uploading of the file. It may have been corrupted when used by the doctor or surgeons. There might be a defect in the 3D printer or in the raw materials used in the printing process. There might be a human error in the printing process or in the post-3D printing production process. There might be human error in the implementation of the design or in the selection or use of raw materials. There might be human error in the image scanning for a custom device design. And then, of course, there might be, to the extent that there is any labeling, there might be an issue with that. The bottom line is that unlike the traditional framework, there are a host of potentially liable persons or entities whose alleged fault may have caused the defect that led to the injury. Again, assuming that there was a defect and it's not something else. As a result, it does not make sense from a fairness or justice perspective to hold any one person or the entire group on this list strictly liable for an injury that was suffered. Since anyone or anything on this list could be liable, but it is doubtful, at least in the current state of the law, that any of them would be held to a strict liability standard where just a defect, causation, and injury would result in their liability. For example, the person who designed a predicate device upon which the CAD file is based is not likely to be responsible for a defect in another device which is not actually designed or sold by that product designer. And so they're not likely to be strictly liable based upon an injury suffered by a device that they have nothing really to do with. Similarly, a defect in the printer is not likely to make the printer manufacturer strictly liable for a device. In the same way that a defect in a blowtorch would not make a blowtorch manufacturer liable for a defect in a building that was built using that blowtorch. The end result, I believe, is going to be a return to a much harder to prove negligence standard when trying to prove liability for a defective product that was 3D printed at a point of service facility, again, as opposed to a traditional product manufacturer. Now, this is not a bad thing from a defense perspective. It is certainly an argument that I or any product liability lawyer would make to avoid having a client have to defend a strict liability lawsuit under these circumstances. The burden of proof and what you have to prove is just much higher and harder in a negligence case. I mean, think about the difficulties of proving the liability of any one person on that long list. You would effectively have to rule out all other causes of the defect and or demonstrate that the defect clearly arose from the conduct of one person on this list in order to get there on a negligence claim. And when it comes to something like a corrupted file or a copying error, one may not even be able to prove that any one person was responsible or could be held liable for a defect which happened there. Because of the difficulties of proof and the difficulties of even finding a culpable party for some kinds of defects, the plaintiff's bar will be pushing back so as to establish certainty and a finding of strict liability for someone in this process. What will happen? As I said, there's very little prior litigation to guide us regarding this issue, but there is something. The Buckley case cited here involved a 3D printed dental implant. The plaintiff sued Invisalign, claiming that it failed to communicate to the plaintiff that the implants would not resolve plaintiff's problem. In other words, the ultimate issue was the adequacy of the warnings that were given to the plaintiff regarding these implants. The patient sued Invisalign, arguing that the warnings should have been provided by the 3D printing company. The court, following traditional product liability rules in a 3D printing case employed the learned intermediary doctrine to shield the company that 3D printed the implants from liability, effectively finding them to be a traditional manufacturer. Here, the court did not stray from the traditional product liability framework, and it found that a third party using 3D printing to make custom devices was a, quote, manufacturer. What the case does not tell us is what will happen if the additive manufacturer is the medical treater themselves. In that case, the learned intermediary doctrine probably won't apply because there's no learned intermediary between the plaintiff and the manufacturer. The learned intermediary is the manufacturer. Following the logic of this decision, the manufacturer of implants would fall into the practice of dentistry, which will move the standard from strict liability to a standard of care framework or a negligence framework. The Colley case, while not a printing case, gives us a sense of whether a defect in the CAD file would make the CAD file designer liable for a defect in the product. In the Colley case, a cutting guide used in a surgical procedure was custom manufactured using software and imaging from a patient. The guide was alleged to be defective, causing an injury. The plaintiff sought to argue that the software used to create the guide was defective and therefore hold the software manufacturer potentially liable for the defect in the injury. The court held that the software was part of the product, like a product component, and therefore a defect in the software could make this component part manufacturer liable for defect in the product. While this is not a 3D printing case per se, the Colley case clearly could have an impact on the potential liability for persons in the manufacturing chain associated with the 3D printed medical device, and that would include not only a defect, let's say, in the raw materials, but also potentially in the CAD file. So the next question then is the CAD file a product or a product component, or is it something else? If it is a product, then maybe the CAD file designer could be held strictly liable for a defective 3D printed device. But in general, what is a product for purposes of strict liability analysis in most areas under the current state of the law in most jurisdictions is that a product does not include an intangible thing, and that would be something like a computer-aided design file. Although there have been exceptions, I should say, to this general rule for things like electricity and navigational maps, which are also intangible, but have been found to be products. So let's say the CAD file is created and sold to a hospital, which uses it to manufacture an implant that is later found to be defective. If that file is a product and is sold to the hospital and considered a component part of the defective product, maybe there will be an ultimate finding that such a product, the CAD file, if defective, could support a strict liability claim against the CAD file seller and maybe the designer. At the end of the day, it could go either way, and the final determination of whether the CAD file sold to a doctor that leads to a 3D printed medical device is ultimately found to be defective as a product may ultimately depend on factors we cannot even anticipate at this time. It's going to be a lot of science. It's going to go into what exactly is software or what exactly is this file. But there are other considerations as well. What if the CAD file is not purchased, but instead is downloaded from an open source? Such an open source file might be copied several times. It might be altered along the way. And under those circumstances, it will likely be much harder to hold the CAD file designer strictly liable. And so that's the issue with the product and the CAD file. So now let's just talk about the litigation challenges generally. So litigation arising out of 3D printing, just in the product liability realm, will have a number of challenges for plaintiffs, which of course is good news for defendants, at least for now. And those challenges include, what is the actual product design? Is it the predicate device, if there is one? Is it the software, or is it the scanned image? The burden is on the plaintiff to prove that the design is defective and that the defect caused the injury. Here, since the designer and the manufacturer are clearly different, and since either could cause a defect, it creates a new and interesting challenge for plaintiffs, as well as a new and interesting potential defense for anyone associated with the 3D printing process. It also creates a lot more potential defendants, all of whom have to defend themselves in the event that there is a product defect that causes an injury. Another challenge is to determine who is the designer. Is it the image taker, the CAD file creator, the predicate device designer, or even the surgeon who puts it all together and prints the device. Next, whether printing a device is, there will have to be a determination as to whether printing a device is, quote, manufacturing, or is it, quote, a service, or is it, quote, the practice of medicine. If you're a defendant in these cases, you're going to argue that it's a service or the practice of medicine because the burden of proof is much higher for negligence than for the manufacturing process, which could see a strict liability standard. Finally, what is the product? Is it the device that failed, the design file, the 3D printer? This will become part of the debate as well when the litigation starts. So what will happen? My best guess is that traditional manufacturers who use 3D printing for cost savings and customization will be treated and regulated the same as always. However, product failures in the point of service manufacturing and use context will see a fight over what standard is appropriate, negligence or strict liability, with the negligence standard being used in most cases. And this just makes sense because point of service manufacturing and use really is a significant diversion from the present product liability model. Justice and fairness will now allow courts to pin liability for a defect on just one person in a long line of potential causes based on strict liability. However, strict liability will make a comeback, I think, in limited circumstances, especially where the defect can be easily identified and only where the defect derives from the design of the product. If doctors are manufacturing devices using 3D printers and making mistakes in the manufacturing of those devices, I do expect that this may become part of the practice of medicine, and a standard of care is going to grow up around that issue. If this does occur, then a new standard of care in the manufacture and point of service and use of medical devices will have to be developed potentially by potential regulation by local medical boards. Whether they will step into this vacuum remains to be seen. I expect that the most exciting stuff coming out of 3D printing, including the use of organic-based medical devices with patient-specific customization, we'll see a hybrid development in the law between medical malpractice and product liability until another better standard is found. It will more likely lean more heavily towards the negligence standard with the rapid development of a standard of care for surgeons who do this type of work. Finally, we'll talk briefly about risk management suggestions since we're running out of time. If you are someone in the design or manufacturing process, you will need to identify your risks. That's the key. Those persons will have to understand that they may be sued along with anyone else in the process if something goes wrong with a 3D printed medical device. And it just makes sense that you're, because there are so many different players or parts in this process, and because there's no clear defendant in these cases, it's the most logical thing for a plaintiff's attorney to do is to do the scattershot approach and just sue everyone under the sun. Without useful FDA guidance, entities involved in the 3D printing process will look to emerging industry standards, especially for manufacturing. There are a number of groups in the manufacturing industry like ASTM, which have working groups that are thinking about and providing standards for 3D or additive manufacturing already. Non-traditional manufacturers may need to diversify their insurance. This is really important for doctors and hospitals who may be relying on E&O insurance as a risk management measure. Some E&O policies exclude product liability claims or claims arising out of the sale of a product. There may be disputes over whether 3D printing a medical device constitutes the practice of medicine or a professional service, or whether it's a professional service that may be identified in an E&O policy declaration. So if you're looking for E&O coverage, and your E&O coverage is limited to a specific declaration that says you do the practice of medicine, and you're printing medical devices and implanting them in people, there may be a dispute as to whether or not the printing of that medical device is the practice of your medicine, or if it's something else that you're doing that's outside the professional services that the insurer intended to cover. So anyone who prints a medical device should review their policy with their broker and potentially a coverage lawyer to determine ahead of time whether the policy covers this activity and and look to purchase a separate policy or secure an add-on to your policy, which does provide coverage for this activity. Attention should be given to using indemnity and hold harmless agreements with third parties involved in the 3D manufacturing process. This is another important risk management tool. If your company uses a 3D printer, you may want to enter into a quality agreement to ensure the quality of the 3D printed materials that you receive. If you are working with a third-party 3D printer and you are using their forms, you may be indemnifying, holding them harmless for any claims. You should understand that if you are taking on this risk, and if so, and you cannot negotiate your way out of it, that you ought to secure insurance coverage to protect yourself from this risk as well. Following the regulatory and legal developments is another important risk management tool. Certainly attending webinars like this one is a useful way to do so. Another risk management tool is the implementation of use restrictions. Use restrictions are restrictions on the use of whatever you are selling that limits the use of that product in certain ways, or else any liability for the use of the product is waived or limited by the user. A use restriction which narrowly limits the scope of the use also invites a defense of misuse if the use is outside the scope of what the use restriction provides. For example, if you're a CAD file designer and you wish to sell designs for medical devices for use with 3D printers, your sale of the CAD file can include a use restriction regarding the copying or alteration of the CAD file, or for the use of the CAD file by anyone who did not purchase the CAD file directly from you. It might also restrict other things as well. Finally, if you are a point-of-service manufacturer and user of medical devices like a hospital, and you go beyond the use of just the use of the medical devices and you start to sell those devices to third parties, you have very likely expanded your involvement beyond the practice of medicine and turned yourself into potentially a medical device manufacturer, which would make you subject to FDA regulation and would also subject you, if something goes wrong, to strict liability products law. Obviously, that opens up such an entity to a world of new potential risk management issues and regulatory pitfalls. If this is you or somebody listening to this presentation, I strongly recommend that you speak with Medmarc, especially Sarah Dyson, who I've talked to about this issue, and she may be able to help you with these risk management challenges. That's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, and thank you for that plug at the end. We'll now begin the Q&A session. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A panel located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your question in the space provided, hit the send button. Make sure you direct that question to all panelists in the Ask menu. So Daniel, we had a couple come in already. First question, have you heard about 3D printed vaccines by chance?
So yeah, I have not touched much upon, did not touch much upon pharmaceuticals in this presentation, but it's certainly another area of exploding interest and use for 3D additive manufacturing. I am aware that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has funded a project for 3D printed vaccinations where active pharmaceutical ingredients are basically put into these tiny little cups, which are made of a substance that degrades over time. And which effectively allows the vaccines to be released over time. The creation of these little cups was actually developed at MIT, and it's a new type of 3D printing. The benefit, of course, is that someone only needs to be vaccinated once, and the delayed release offered by this material acts like what we would think is a booster shot. So you get one vaccination. Because of the timed release, you get multiple doses, and you don't have to come back for a booster shot. And so this application would be hugely advantageous, especially for vaccinations in developing countries, which is why I suspect Bill and Melinda Gates are involved in that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another one here. With respect to hospitals undertaking 3D printing, must they still adhere to quality system requirements like design controls, et cetera?
It's not clear that they do because they are printing them, and they are, well, first of all, they should. I think they should, and certainly they ought to. Whether FDA will actually regulate them on that is another question, because it may fall within the scope of the practice of medicine and outside the scope of device manufacture. But certainly, there's a good reason why we have those regulations in place, and that's to ensure, especially for post-production, avoid contamination and that sort of thing.
Okay, it looks like we've got time for one more, and it came in. Can you give an example of a use restriction in the context of a product liability claim?
So, yeah. We see these use restrictions a lot in, like, the agricultural industry with restrictions on the use of seeds, for instance. Others using those products, they come with these use restrictions and limitations of liability, which effectively voids warranties associated with those seeds and limits liability for non-authorized users of those seeds. Those restrictions have been held enforceable on later product liability claims, especially arising out of crop failures. As I said, these underlying principles could be employed by CAD file sellers to avoid potential liability for copied, modified, or corrupted files. They might also limit use of particular types of printers or printing processes and to the use of particular types of materials in the printing process. A use restriction might void or limit liability for the failure of the user to engage in proper post-production processes that might lead to a defect, like contamination as well. So, yeah, they're usually seen in agricultural litigation, but I think they would have equal application here. Of course, it will depend upon the specific jurisdiction as to whether or not they will be enforceable.
Okay, well, I think that's probably all the time we have. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation, such a hot topic, and so packed with great information. So thanks, Daniel.